I'm so glad you joined us today. I hope you're feeling fired up and ready to learn and think about how to push first changes. I'm Miriam Axel-Lute. I'm the editor-in-chief at Shelterforce. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, though probably most of you are, we're a national nonprofit publication covering affordable housing, community development, and housing justice. If you're not receiving our weekly emails that let you know about our most recent content, plus top comments, events, resources, and jobs, you can sign up in the link, which will appear shortly in the chat. So several times a year, we run what we call our Under the Lens series, where we do a deep dive into a specific topic. This summer, we published one called Homes or Cash Cows, focused on the financialization of housing. And this week, we're launching one called Tenant Power Returns on tenant organizing. And you'll be getting new content in that series for the next 5 weeks. Today's event is going to link these two because so many of our authors and reporters in Homes or Cash Cows noted that strengthening tenant protections is a crucial way to push back against some of the worst abuses of finance firms playing in the housing market, especially since so many of them have business models that actually rely upon displacement and exploitation of their residents. So we have a really great group of speakers for you today who are going to give us some more context about how these two things connect, where the opportunities are to fight back, and where and how some wins are happening. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. I am going to let them introduce themselves when they answer their first question. But first, before we jump in, I just want to make one very important request. During November and December, all donations up to $1,000 to Shelterforce are matched through the News Match program. And if you start a new recurring donation, your whole year's worth will be matched. So if you've ever found Shelterforce's content useful, inspiring, or important, this is a really important time for us. And please donate and tell your friends and colleagues. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Ben to come off mute and start us off. Introduce yourself, and Ben, give us some context as to how we got here in terms of these large financial firms having such a presence in the housing market, and why would increased tenant protections make a difference?
Sure. Thank you, Miriam, and it's great to be with everyone here today. So my name is Ben Teresa. I'm an associate professor of Urban and Regional Studies and Planning at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I also co-direct the RVA Richmond, Virginia Eviction Lab, where we focus on data and research for supporting policymakers, service providers, and organizers and advocates to address housing instability. So to get us started, the rise of large-scale corporate investors in housing markets is something that we've seen across the urban hierarchy. So it takes place in urban context, suburban context, and rural context as well, across high-demand, expensive cities, declining, disinvested cities as well. It happens internationally, outside of the US, and across the housing sector. So in rental housing markets, in home ownership markets, and in a sort of a proliferating set of new market spaces like land contracts, contract for deeds, rent to own market spaces. And so I just begin there to say that this is a trend that is not just in a single family rental market. It's not just in high demand places, and it's not just in the US context. Certainly it manifests differently in all these different places. So I think it's important also to place the rise it's out of the large corporate investor in housing markets, not just, of course, in the last year or two, where we've seen some sort of dramatic expansion of those activities in certain periods of the pandemic, but to really put it in a kind of deeper historical context. So I think there's maybe three key larger scale transformations that really give rise to this new type of investor and the new types of market spaces that they are creating and all of the effects for tenants, communities, and cities. So the first one, of course, is sort of the long-term privatization and austerity regimes at the local level, state level, and federal level that really has disinvested from public commitment to affordable housing, direct construction and provision of publicly owned housing. So obviously, public housing being one of the biggest examples of this. Secondly, there's been a long-term transformation in terms of the housing market and financial and capital markets. So we often talk about this as financialization, or really what we see is the continued integration of real estate and financial markets, which means that housing property is treated increasingly as a financial asset with the kinds of expectations that come from financial assets, that they'll continue to produce income, to increase in value, and the kinds of imperatives that places to continually extract rents, fees from housing at the ground level, and to kind of innovate new market spaces. And this is where, the government at key historical junctures in the early 1990s, after the savings and loan crisis, the federal government, steps in and provides, to deal with financial crisis, basically sets a template for private capital to come in and take distressed assets, foreclosed homes, delinquent loans on property, to facilitate, what is really a crisis of financial markets and a crisis of profitability, and sort of transform those into new market opportunities, as opposed to, in stabilizing housing and stabilizing people in housing, kind of recreating, facilitating new market opportunities. And then finally, increasing inequality in labor markets, of course, over the past 40 years or more, means that people have constrained choice in their housing options. And it also means that urban growth in of itself is increasingly less effective in terms of delivering, that growth down towards those who really need to benefit the most. So that means that kind of a growing city might be producing a lot of housing, but that housing is not actually reaching those who need it the most. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to turn to Cornell now to tell us a little bit about what this looks like on the ground in Florida and how it's affecting both tenants and potential homebuyers there.
Thank you, Miriam. Good afternoon, everyone. Cornell Cruz, Jr., Executive Director from the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida. We're a nonprofit membership organization serving the state of Florida, based in Miami. So how this is affecting the state of Florida. The state of Florida is going through a serious housing crisis, either with rent or folks who want to purchase. And let's start with the purchase side first. One of the big items that's happening in our state is corporate buyers. And these are hedge funders and Wall Street organizations who are buying up homes, sight unseen, buying up the single family homes and turning them into forever rentals. In the second quarter, in Miami-Dade County alone, which engulfs the city of Miami and the county, in Miami-Dade County alone in the second quarter, investors, hedge funders, and Wall Street investors bought $2.75 billion worth of single family homes in that particular quarter. In our state now, one in every 4.5 closings, housing closings that are done by corporate buyers. Those include hedge funders and Wall Streeters who are buying up these homes, some of them sight unseen, and just buying up the homes and not giving everybody the right to the American dream. They're turning them into forever rentals. They charge astronomical rents, and with no opportunity to ever purchase or own the land. Hedge funders are on a different mindset. For instance, 60 Minutes did a piece on this back in March, and they focused on the state of Florida, in particular the Tampa area. One of the leaders of these hedge funders actually said into the camera, he actually said, Americans no longer want to buy the American dream, they want to rent it. I found that very, very insulting when we know that building generational wealth comes from, for the most part in this country, comes from owning land and purchasing homes. We know how important purchasing homes, being a homeowner and or landowner is, simply by the fact that the hedge funders continuously are buying the land up, and the fact that there's a reason why the Pilgrims took all the land from the Indians, because it's wealth. We know that it's wealth. So in our particular state, this is an ongoing problem. Trying to bring it to the attention of legislators and elected officials. They seem to be way behind the power curve. As far as renting is concerned, our rents are astronomical here in our state. We are now, in particular, South Florida, which includes Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. It costs more to live here now, and it attributes a whole lot of factors, but it costs more to live here than it does in Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York. And a whole lot of factors come into it: income inequality, bad transportation policies, and so on. So that all factors into it. The rents have been, you've had a few governments, county and city governments try to help with rent, to help folks with rent, but that's only a temporary solution. We had one county just on election day last week, Orange County, which is the Orlando area. They voted to have a 1-year rent stabilization and a 9.8% cap. 1 year, that's all they wanted, was 1 year rent stabilization. 59% of the voters voted for it, but of course, several organizations led the fight against it, including the Florida Realtors Association and the Apartment Owners Association. And it's in appeals court now, saying that it's unconstitutional and the election officials can't certify those election results, even though that's what the people wanted. So we have a lot of headwinds going against us as we try to rent stabilize, encourage home ownership, encourage land ownership, and give folks a peace of mind and also help towards building generational wealth. It is a challenge that has to be met. We cannot continue on this goal, on this road. We cannot continue with rents not being stabilized, and in our state, rent stabilization is not a thing. So we can't go on in this factor where we continuously have rents that are out of reach, home ownership that is out of reach and unaffordable, and not having enough affordable housing, and not having a housing affordability. One of our organizations, Miami Homes for All, did a study just on Dade County, which is Miami-Dade County, earlier this summer. Right, as of right now, as of June, we needed 221,000 affordable housing units to try to meet the need. And you got to figure that we fall farther and farther behind every 30 days. So we have a lot of issues here, and it's something that we definitely have to address. We believe that housing is a right, so we keep looking at ways in order to encourage the powers that be to help us with this, with rent as well as home ownership. Thank you.
Thanks, Cornell. We're gonna go to Sofia. And Sofia, in your work with tenant organizers around the country, why is addressing this particular kind of corporate ownership particularly important, and how could increased tenant protections help?
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everyone. So nice to be here with all of you. My name is Sofia Sheher. I'm with the Action Center on Race and Economy. And for folks who don't know us, we're a racial justice organization, and we're focused on Wall Street accountability. Because I work so closely with organizers across the country, the question that I get more often than anything else is, can you help me understand who this landlord is and how we can fight back against all of the things that they are clearly doing, motivated by greed? And based on my work with organizations, I see that the private equity and financialized housing model is just pure business logic, which I think most people know, and just so acutely focused on maximizing revenue and cutting costs. And so the stories that I hear from tenants really make clear to me why tenant protections would be so powerful in cutting into the worst parts of this business model. So I characterize it into four main buckets. The first is increasing rents. So just for example, I've heard from organizers in North Carolina and Las Vegas both, where tenants face increases of $100 to $200 per month and really intense pressure to sign lease renewals really quickly. And if they don't within a certain allotted time frame, that triggers month-to-month leases with doubled rents. And now we know, thanks to research that came out of ProPublica, that a lot of these rent increases are actually fueled by, algorithmic pricing in ways that might potentially be violating antitrust law. So, an important piece of information. Fines and fees are another one. So actually, Cornell mentioned the 60 Minutes piece. One of the landlord CEOs that they talked to was a gentleman named Gary Berman. He's the CEO of Tricon Residential. And just for context, back in 2020, after Tricon received an investment from Blackstone, this person, Gary Berman, said, quote, "The pandemic has been a godsend for our business. In a sense, it's the best thing that ever happened to us." Just imagine, it ties into the sort of crises that Ben is talking about that create these moments where these kinds of landlords are able to take advantage. So on fines and fees, Tricon's profits tripled between 2020 and 2021. And in their SEC filings, they talked about being able to take in $640 per home per month in fee and other revenue. So that's on top of rent. And in their filings, they talked about being able to increase that figure to between $850 to $950 per month. That's on the revenue side. On the cut side, there are things like cuts to maintenance and offloading responsibilities to tenants. So, for example, in 2021, tenants in Minneapolis, organizing with the organization Inquilinos Unidos, were talking about needing to wait up to a year for necessary and urgent repairs in homes that are managed. At the time, they were managed by Havenbrook Homes, now managed by Progress Residential. And issues included holes in their roofs and ceilings, broken stairways, lead paint, flooding, faulty electrical systems, and broken or inoperable appliances, in addition to other things. So things actually got so bad in 2022 that the same portfolio of properties was ordered to they actually lost their residential license, and conditions were deemed to be putting residents' lives at risk. That is just how bad it got in a suburb of Minneapolis. And the last one is eviction. So I think a lot of us might have seen a report that came out of the House Financial Services Committee about eviction filings that were happening during the COVID crisis. And research in that report documents that certain landlords resorted to knocking on tenants' doors in the middle of the night, replacing air conditioning units with faulty ones as ways to pressure people to leave their homes, or I think even giving people misleading information to make people believe that they were going to be forced and maybe didn't have the same protections that they thought would be available to them. And just to note, all of this happens behind this incredibly convoluted and totally opaque LLC structure that makes it so difficult for tenants to know who actually owns their home. I like to think I'm pretty good at this kind of research, and even I struggle at times to know exactly how much of a portfolio a private equity company might be invested in. So that was a lot of stories, but I think it's important for us to know that a lot, particularly with these single family rental companies, a lot of them are concentrated in specific markets across the Sun Belt and Midwest. Though if you read filings from multifamily companies too, you know those same markets are incredibly important to them. They also happen to be markets that have incredibly weak tenant protections. And there's a financial advantage to these landlords in operating there and growing their portfolios there. So just to kind of close up, with robust tenant protections, we don't get things like 50% rent increases or 20 to 30% average rent increases that we're seeing in some of the hottest markets in the country. It's why things like rent stabilization and rent control are so important to protect people from the worst parts of this industry. With the right to counsel or just cause eviction, it's illegal to kick tenants out in order to be able to turn around and charge higher rents. And with transparency and ownership, we know who actually owns these buildings, and we have a better idea of where to go when problems arise. And we know these aren't the cure-all to everything that's happening in our housing market or the ways in which investors are harming people, but we know this is a huge step towards moving us to a place where we actually have a market where everybody can afford a beautiful, decent, safe, quality home. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophia. We're having some technical issues and we've lost our other speaker temporarily, hopefully just temporarily. So we will come back to him because I definitely want to hear his story of organizing on the ground. But for right now, I'm just going to move on to our next question. And this is, moving from, we've been talking about what the problems are, and we're going to move on to what some of the ways that we try to solve that. And landlord and tenant law is typically local, but states often also weigh in to set parameters about what's possible, and they can do that in good and bad ways. So I'm hoping that all of you can weigh in a bit about what the rules are for cities and states. And then people have already been asking about federal in the chat, and we will come to federal next because we definitely want to get to that as well. So whoever wants to jump in and start, Cornell or Sofia, perhaps.
Oh, okay, I'll jump in. I know that I saw in the chat that there's been some housing associations who have tried to implement some plans to try to stop from corporate buyers, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately, as you said, Miriam, the elected officials or legislatures will not do anything to enact ways or haven't done anything to enact ways to curtail this practice and to curtail the practice of, as Sofia was talking about, raising rents. We had one building here in particular, right on the water. The building raised the rents up to 75%, and they took in order to drive out tenants so they can rent it at a higher rate. What did happen though is that the commissioners and the mayor helped implement a program, or tried to implement are implementing a program to put there has to be a 60-day notice for rent hikes that are over 7%. So anything over 7%, they have to give a 60-day notice at least. Granted, that makes it even more difficult because it's not like there's a lot of units in order to rent that are reasonable when you're trying to find a place that's reasonable and safe and to live. Those are few and far between, but at least gave some reprieve because it was happening like every other week. There was another big article or another big item in the media about the raising of rents. I think that we have to engage the elected officials. We have to engage the legislators at some point in order to try to help preempt some of these things. Also, I also believe that I know particularly in my state, if the legislature or the governor does not like something that a municipality, city, or county is implementing, they'll find a way to undercut it so that it doesn't happen. So if they try to do something, well, or they try to do something for the good of the community, or try to do something for the good of the renters as well as homeowners, and they don't like that particular item, they'll find a way to undercut it by saying something along the lines, well, they can't do this without our approval. This is at a state level and not at a local level. They'll do things like that in order to deter policies from being implemented, particularly in certain counties, from policies that being implemented in order to help change how the corporate is either raising rents or buying up the housing. So we're going to have to engage in one way or the other, and we may even have to. There's going to be things we're going to have to take folks to court in order to try to make change.
I'm happy to pick up next on some of these local and state level dynamics. I live in Texas, so I also live in a city, unfortunately, where if at the local level we were able to mobilize and win tenant protections, we would also face preemption at the state level. So much of ACRE's analysis is rooted in corporate power and the ways in which our local, state, and federal dynamics are dominated by corporate interests. And our antidote to that is building tenant power and really building power for tenants, certainly, but I think for all people who are being exploited in our housing market, which I think is tenants and beyond. Having a safe, decent, and affordable place to live, it shouldn't boil down to the luck of where you happen to be born, where your family lives, where your job is located. Certainly, that's a feeling that I have at times. I'm from Texas originally, and I don't have the luck of living in a state or a city that is more friendly to tenant protection. So that means that there is long and hard work to do to try and change those dynamics to flip in the other direction. I think like one of the core interventions that an organization like ACRE has to offer is an analysis of how we got to this situation. So for states like mine that have rent control preemption, I have spent a lot of time looking at organizations like the National Multifamily Housing Council. And for people who haven't heard of them, they are a massive lobbying group, and many of their members are actually the private equity companies themselves and the landlord groups that they have set up. And I've read in real estate industry papers where the NMHC takes credit or is given credit for rent control preemptions that exist across the country. So there's been a very concerted effort by the landlord industry, and particularly large corporate landlord industry, to keep tenants from having the kinds of things that they need across the country, within particular cities, within particular states. So it's important to know that that is where the power sits, and that's where we have to take that power on. I do think that there are probably a number of creative things that local governments can do. In some ways, this is like a newer issue, or maybe a new cut of an old issue. And so I think there are questions to probe around how we regulate LLCs. Is there a way to promote some kind of transparency at the local level to at least start to build things like registries of where violations are happening? And also, I think, what do we do when those kinds of violations take place to make sure that people don't end up displaced? So I think that I personally feel a lot of excitement for the energy that is bubbling up through organized tenant power. I think it has the potential. I know certainly the industry is very worried about the potential that it has to change dynamics at the state level. And I think we only have, there's no way to go but through. And to me, that through is continuing to build out that tenant power.
Thanks, Sofia. Ben, could you give us a bit of you mentioned thoughts about New York and how a positive thing about state level intervention?
Sure. So I think that one of the ways to think about policy is that it, of course, delivers immediate benefits and relief, targeted in that way, but also policy as a opening new terrain for power building and organizing. So, for example, what Miriam was referring to was the 2019 New York State reform to the rent laws, which closed a number of loopholes in rent stabilization regime. And crucially, what it also did is it expanded the number, it expanded the ability to opt in to rent stabilization beyond New York City and a couple of immediate surrounding towns to the statewide. And so immediately what happened is that you blew open the terrain, literally the geography for organizing tenants for rent stabilization expanded statewide. And so most recently, we can see that playing out as Kingston, up the Hudson from New York City, Kingston opted into rent stabilization, and their rent guidelines board recently voted for a 15% rollback reduction in rents. And so I think thinking strategically, as of course, organizers and advocates always think strategically, but thinking about policy as how can it operate and give us more room to maneuver and build towards those kind of future opportunities. I do want to just highlight what Sofia was saying, which is totally on the money, I think, about what the real pressure points are. And, the National Multifamily Housing Council for the last couple of years has published a report on what state they produce a map of what states are threatening rent control, or they literally have 3 tiers of states and their risk levels for enacting rent control, or the few states that have rent control, they're on the top lists of offenders in their eyes, right? And so this is a central preoccupation of the industry. And so I think that demonstrates where it cuts into their power. We also have, the example of the struggle over emergency rental assistance through the pandemic and how uneven that was. And the industry within 9 months elevated, right, their challenge of the CDC renter protections to the Supreme Court, which ultimately nullified the CDC renter protections, alongside a real apathy. The ERA fund is, the last time I checked in the last month or so, there's still a third of the nearly $50 billion for rental debts that remains unspent. So you see what the industry priorities are. So, kind of knocking down regulation and constraints over their control of their assets and their investments is the #1 priority. And actually kind of cash payments is kind of like, well, if the power is going to be constrained, then they'll issue cash payments in favor of maintaining control over their assets. And so I think strategically thinking, expanding, right, the terrain for organizing and room to maneuver for advocates and organizers, as well as, sort of pinpointing these major kind of pressure points that favor, of how landlords and the industry exert control over tenants and their properties, which are fundamentally where their sources of power come from.
It's great. So we have Tony back, and I'm going to try and see. I can't figure out how to spotlight him, but Tony, if you start talking, will you show up?
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
We can at least hear you. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the power of large landlords affecting tenants on your local level, and then maybe you can fold in what you had to say about the topic that we're on right now about local and state relationships of those levels, because I know in California you had a relationship between your a state level law and the local rent control law that you were trying to pass.
Thank you, Miriam. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Tony. I am the co-director of organizing at Monument Impact, located in Contra Costa County in the Bay Area here in California. And yeah, excited to be here and excited to share space with all my colleagues here who I'm sure have already been sharing a lot of knowledge and everything that they're doing in their area of work. And so it's, a lot of the organizing that we have been doing here at the local level has been really trying to pass rent control specifically in the city of Antioch, which we were successful at. We, got that victory. But, it was a very difficult one, of course, because of what Miriam mentioning around a state law that does exist here in the state of California, which is the Tenant Protection Act, or AB 1482, which essentially requires landlords to have just cause for eviction and limits rent increases to 10%, right? So that is the state law, and obviously, it, like many state laws, it has its loopholes. And so, but ideally, this is the argument that the opposition was using, right? And why local jurisdictions or local cities don't need rent control, because we have a state law that already provides those protections to tenants, right? And so this was the argument that the California Apartment Association would use, that certain city council members who were against rent control would say and argue. But as I mentioned before, the 1482 obviously does protect tenants, right? It is something that is important and something that many people organized and advocated for. And it was a huge win, especially as we were entering the start of the pandemic in 2020, right? It did protect a lot of families from remaining in their home. But we knew that there was a lot of loopholes, right? And so one of those people or properties that are not protected, or apartment complexes that are not protected, are the low-income housing, right? Tenants who are not protected under 1482. And so in Antioch, when we were organizing for rent control or rent stabilization, we were very clear in our demands that low-income housing complexes have to be included in the policy, right? Because the tenants that were impacted the most, who were receiving high rent increases of $200, $500, $600, were tenants that were coming from these low-income housing. And so we were very clear that they needed to be included into the rent control policy. And because of the organizing and advocacy from the tenants who were directly being impacted by all of this, along with organizers like Monument Impact, the East County Regional Group here, ACE, we were able to organize and mobilize a bunch of tenants from these different light tech properties or low-income housing properties into getting that written into the policy. And so, that's why we organized for rent control, because we knew that the people that were being impacted the most were low-income community members who are Black, who are Latinx, who are immigrants, right, who are undocumented. And so that's why for them it was super important that their voices be heard, and that they should be the ones at the forefront, and they were. And I think because of this, we were successful in moving City Council to vote in favor of rent control.
That's great, Tony. Thank you. Just not that long ago, new rent control laws were considered dead on arrival. They wouldn't happen anywhere. So I think that's just really important to pay attention to that and realize how much things have shifted, that the dynamics have shifted in the country. So we had mentioned, and a couple people have brought up in the chat, what's the federal role in all this? So landlord tenant law mostly doesn't happen at the federal level, but what can we look to in terms of organizing or pressure at the federal level, maybe to remove some of the unfair advantages that these large corporate landlords have, or to counteract some of the state level obstacles in places like Florida and Texas, where the state steps in the way? Ben, maybe you could start.
Sure. So I know Tony just mentioned subsidized properties. And so I think this is, one place to start this conversation, which has already been, I've seen some discussion swirling around, federal rent freeze for all federally subsidized properties, including those properties that have a mortgage held by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So Fannie and Freddie, of course, subsidize multifamily housing finance. And so, with that portfolio, so we might remember that the CARES Act actually had an eviction moratorium, I believe a 60 or 90-day moratorium in the original CARES Act that was passed at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. So it included a federal moratorium, again, on all federally subsidized properties, including those that didn't necessarily receive operating subsidy from a subsidy program, but just had their mortgage held by Fannie or Freddie. So I think something similar in terms of rent freeze or rent stabilization on those properties could be within, certainly within the power of those agencies to do that. And then that would, depending on the context, which region, that probably is 25-30% of rental housing in any particular region. So a significant share. And of course, some of the more vulnerable residents in those properties. The LIHTC properties, so low-income housing tax credit properties, are another key kind of property to be aware of. And so, often it's state housing agencies that administer those tax credits, but nonetheless, the Treasury, which actually operates LIHTC program, given it's a tax credit program, could actually enforce the just cause provisions and require extending lease renewals in LIHTC properties. We also know from research that private LIHTC properties that are operated by for-profit developers actually are quite unstable. They have high eviction rates. That's been demonstrated in research out of Atlanta. And so that's a low-hanging fruit, so to speak, is that, properties that are subsidized with public money need to have these types of anti-eviction policies, as we were talking about earlier, right? We can't be subsidizing instability. So I think that's definitely one avenue that, wouldn't even necessarily require congressional authorization. So, you could do that through the executive branch, with the right kind of pressure. And so I've already seen some of those conversations happening.
I'm happy to dovetail on that. I think that, Ben mentioned so many of the programs that exist that are supposed to alleviate the housing crisis, and yet clearly they have so many challenges with them. And at the same time, I think important to note, kind of fitting within the comments that Ben made initially, programs like LIHTC have emerged as another place for many of these same private equity landlords to increase their share of a different kind of property that they own. So for example, Blackstone recently became, I think, one of, if not the largest owner of LIHTC properties across the country through their acquisition of April Housing that happened in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, or rather an AIG portfolio that now has become April Housing. I think it's important to note that the federal government, not just through the subsidy programs, which I think are good and need to be strengthened and should do more to protect tenants, but also through things like 1031 like-kind exchanges, which are this mechanism where basically if you purchase a property and then sell it, you get to reinvest the earnings into another property tax-free. So you ultimately don't end up paying taxes on the sale at all. This is one of the key things that props up our real estate market in the way that it exists today. So I think just important to know, and it's something that has in the past emerged as a potential area of conversation at the federal level, but there seems to be the political will lacking to do that right now. I think there are REIT structures, right, that are like very favorable from a taxing standpoint to more of these publicly traded, large private equity backed landlords. So there are all of these mechanisms that support the market as it exists today without the matching benefits or protections to make sure that tenants are safe and secure in their homes. So I think, to me, when I think about this, it's just a choice that we're making about where we allocate our resources. So if we're able to prop up a speculative model that ultimately harms tenants, why aren't we able to dedicate those same resources to public housing, which obviously needs tens of millions of dollars of investment, or social housing, community land trusts, the kinds of things that are more democratically governed? I think, there are conversations like the ones that Ben alluded to. I think the Homes Guarantee is doing an incredible job currently of talking to the White House, talking to different agencies to make a push for those agencies or for the White House to act through the authority that they have today. I am sadly a pessimist on what Congress will be able to do, but that doesn't mean that those elected officials get to skirt accountability for making our housing crisis either worse or not doing anything to fix it. So there's kind of a short-term answer. I see a lot of hope in what the Homes Guarantee is trying to accomplish. And there's the long-term answer, similar to what I said with respect to state and local level politics. At the end of the day, though, I want to see more solutions at the federal level, because again, I live in a state where ultimately our ceiling is very low for what we're able to accomplish in the long term. And by no means should our housing policy be the kind of patchwork that we have today.
Absolutely. We are coming toward the end of our time, and I want to make sure we have time for some questions as well as hearing about wins. So I'm going to come back to Tony, then Cornell, and then Sofia briefly just to talk about some of the wins that are happening at your local level, and then we're going to get some audience questions in. So real short and succinct, Tony, just tell us a little bit more about how you won rent control in Antioch and what having it has meant for your members.
Thank you. Yeah, I think folks have been tired of living under the conditions that they have been living in. The rent was being increased, as I mentioned before, $200, $500, $600 for an apartment that just was not worth it, right? And a lot of these habitability issues were going unattended to, something that tenants were getting tired of. The rent was going up, but the living conditions were, terrible, and people were tired. Tired of being abused, not being listened to, their issues not being addressed, that, they started to organize, right? They started to mobilize, showing out to city council meetings, demanding that rent control be brought up, that their demands be listed, that, and that included that light tech be included in the rent policy, that the rent cap be at 3%, right? So these things were all demands that the tenants wanted to see in the rent policy. Holding actions outside of outside of their apartment complex, right? Inviting city council to show up to these actions and mobilizations that were taking place across different properties in the city of Antioch, and inviting, even those who were in opposition to rent control to see the living conditions that a lot of these tenants were living in as proof, right? To say, like, do you think that this apartment is worth the rent increase or what the value is that they're asking for? And folks were tired of just, I think Ben mentioned it earlier, right? The financialization of like real estate that is happening, right? That it's become profit over people. And I think people were tired of that, tired of just, of being abused. And us as Monument Impact, with our organizers, we have been able to kind of teach and develop those organizing skills to tenants who had no idea that organizing was as effective as they have been able to kind of see now with the passing of rent control, right? That now rent control is a victory, and it's a huge victory that many are proud of, but know that it still doesn't address a lot of the habitability issues that are still happening where they're living. And so now there's conversations about forming a tenants union in a lot of these properties, right? And so at least the property that we're working with, that's happening. And so to be able to kind of see that they got a victory, they're still wanting to organize and improve their living conditions, is a win for the entire community of Antioch, because we hope that it causes a ripple effect to other properties to say, we're also tired, right? We want to see an organizing infrastructure happen in the city of Antioch, and that is happening. And also our champions at city council, right? Those were super powerful to have on our side. So at the local level, elections are super important, right? Because they impact what we can get done. And because of that, we were able to win rent stabilization in Antioch. And it shows a message to the entire county of Contra Costa.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Cornell, I'm going to ask you to speak really briefly about what you're doing in South Florida to try to get some of these properties not to be snapped up by corporate landlords, rather, in terms of the equity fund.
I'll be brief, Miriam. One of the things that we're doing is not trying to reinvent the wheel. Let's do what they are doing. Let's put together funding so organizations and the nonprofits can actually buy up the properties and institute some lease to own programs and some programs that can better fit the community. So we have, I'm working to facilitate a agreement between one of the banks whose foundation has been doing some some money to help homeowners get into purchase homes and not get priced out by investors. And one of the quasi governmental organizations who've gotten some money together in order to do the exact same thing. So I'm trying to marry them to those two together so they can do their resources, put their resources together in order to make a bigger impact, hopefully to attract more funding. So things like that, like I said, that's going to be hard to get ours changed because legislators always look at free market, not really understanding what the free market may do to low to moderate income, in particular folks. So marrying those organizations together and then seeking more organizations in order to come together to not reinvent the wheel and do exactly what they do.
Thank you. Sofia, can you give us like 1 or 2 wins that you've seen around the country? And then we're going to bring up some questions.
Yes, I will say generally, most of the organizations that I work with have corporate campaigns. Again, rooted in this analysis that corporations are responsible for so much of the circumstances that dictate our housing conditions. So I will say, the organizations I've worked with have done a really good job of recognizing what potential opportunities to move those corporations look like. And one of them is looking at where a lot of these companies are actually getting their money as a way to help bring the companies to the negotiating table. So that has been very promising in advancing many of these campaigns. One that I was not involved in, but I just have so much respect and admiration for, though, is in San Francisco, where tenants of this massive company, Veritas, were able to win right to bargain collectively with their landlord. And then not only that, they won debt cancellation for people who had back debt from throughout the pandemic, but then they moved to make that a law in San Francisco. So now landlords have to bargain collectively with renters who want to organize. I'm going to drop an article in the chat and hope that it's not behind a paywall. But to me, it's just such an inspiring model of what might be able to happen at a municipal level to force corporations into negotiations with tenants.
That's great. Thank you. So we have a question from the chat for, are any of you aware of any luck with any legislation or regulation or approaches to just limit the size of a housing portfolio that a corporation can own? Has anyone even tried that? Anyone familiar with any?
In my state, it hasn't been tried, and I don't see it happening. I would love for that for that to come into play, but I don't see it happening. Again, legislators have a tendency to say this is the free market, and it has a tend to stay that way. I know in my state, developers and run my state, so I wish it could happen, but I don't see it happening in the near future.
All right, I'm gonna, let's see. There's another question about your thoughts on habitability. So habitability is one of the big issues that came, Tony, you were describing it a lot. What's the best way to get accountability for terrible conditions onto the books? Like what does a good accountability tool for habitability look like?
Well, for us here in Antioch, there's a code enforcement department that tenants are supposed to kind of report. And so we use that really more for keeping track, right, of for tenants, if they end up having to go to court, they have proof to say, like, we've been reporting this to the city, that these conditions have been happening and nothing has been done, right? So we use it more for those accountability purposes, right? And so once we do that, we also reach out to city council to say, hey, we reached out to code enforcement, this tenant reached out, it's been 2 to 3 or a month, sometimes even longer, no one has responded. What can you do on your end to, get them out to the apartment to check out what's happening? And so that is something that we are starting to do. just to keep track of like more for tenants so that they're protected if for whatever reason they ever have to go to court. And it's another way to just hold, the landlord and property managers accountable, and for city council to see like this is happening in your own backyard and you're not doing anything about it.
Yeah, happy to chime in also. You know, I think in my work, because I have the joy of working with people in so many different communities, I've again seen how it's such a patchwork. So, you know, for example, I think that tenants in New York City, for example, they've got this incredible database that shows how many violations have been filed against a particular landlord, how many of them are currently open, and that's a significant piece of information to have when you go to a pension fund and you describe why an investment in a particular company might not be a good idea, or when you're trying to enter into a conversation with maybe your like city council person, or if there's some kind of hook where a landlord might be seeking some kind of incentive. I also named this example in my opening comments about how there's like habitability issues that were so grave in this one Minneapolis suburb that this one landlord, now Progress Residential at the time, Havenbrook Homes, lost their license to operate, which is terrible in some ways. I mean, it's terrible that conditions got so bad. It's also a big problem because that meant that all of these tenants were suddenly displaced and didn't have anywhere to go. I've also been in conversation with folks in Chicago who were telling me that there's more of a receivership type model. So instead of people getting displaced altogether, a property then goes into receivership where it's basically managed by some public entity until there's a process to negotiate who should actually hold it. So I think there are all kinds of ways that this plays out depending on the market that a person is in. And I think it means that we have to be really careful when we're calling for some kind of redress or organizing to make sure that habitability is taken into consideration so that we're shifting property more towards community control and not, unfortunately, displacing a bunch of people until a landlord gets right with city rules and things like that. But I think it is such a powerful measure because it is such an incredible problem right now. And there's an urgency and a responsibility to act that we should be calling on our elected officials to act on.
Thanks, Sophia. We have a question that's coming up a couple times in the chat and wondered if any of you had heard about it. Anyone dealing with large rent increases mid-lease, because specifically, I think this is in LIHTC properties, low-income housing tax credit, because of the recent changes in census, changes in area median income allowed mid-lease rent. We've reported on some in Virginia. There's some other folks in the chat who are seeing it in other places, and they're wondering if there's any organizing happening around that particular issue. Not, it sounds like there's an opportunity there. Yeah, so the folks in the chat connect with each other on that topic, and we'll try to do that as well. One question that's been raised, a number of people spoke on, was this question about the use of public funds, and this goes back to our conversation around federal angles, levers. So emergency rental assistance or other things is sometimes used to incentivize landlords to accept lower income renters. And there's a question about, does anybody have an idea, is this at all effective, or are we just pouring more money into landlords' pockets? Maybe, you know, some ideas around how one would structure those incentives to actually be productive for tenants.
I'll just say real quickly that I think the kind of pursuit of subsidy and using further subsidy to incentivize. So, I mean, it's one thing to talk about small area fair market rents, which is the idea with like the housing voucher, that there could be a higher payment standard, like a higher rent allowed for in different parts of the region, rather than just like the median payment standard used for the whole region, which can open up some access. That's one thing, but There's also, I mean, I'm not sure if this is exactly what the question is getting at, but I know there's been other discussions of, well, we need, you know, additional subsidy to incentivize landlords to uptake the housing voucher. And I do think that this sort of just offering these additional bribes, you know, for landlords to house people is really a dead end. I mean, I think what the industry has demonstrated over and over again is that they will prioritize control over their tenants, over their screening process, over their right to evict, over this kind of cash, immediate cash, because they understand their sort of long-term ability to generate profitability is controlling all of those aspects of their investment. So I think that kind of the twin part of simultaneously using policy and organizing to build power to in opposition to property owners, as well as, you know, market pressure, which sometimes we think of, you know, market pressure as, oh, you know, if there's more just any type of additional housing in the market, this will exert market pressure. I think that actually you need a very specific type of market competition, right? And that would be very targeted at the, you know, lowest segment of the market. So it directly competes with the, you know, the affordable housing, or the, you know, the private market sector that is serving, you know, the lowest income renters. You need to really kind of compete with the private market at that level, which is, by the, you know, historically why public housing in the United States was sabotaged kind of from day one, is because the real estate industry recognized its threat to its business model, that it would actually, you know, provide a better and source of housing for low-income renters, and then cut into that segment of the market's profitability.
Great. Any final thoughts? We're a little past 2. Anything else that you want to add? Short closing thoughts.
I think I just appreciate all of the energy in the chat. I wish I could have read everybody's comments as they were coming in. I'm going to drop my contact information if anybody wants to talk about issues with particular corporate landlords or further discussion on how we fight back against them. I'd be happy to hear from anyone who is here.
Anyone else? Great. I'm just going to reiterate that we're in a time when tenant protections and tenant rights are being won in various places, and we have a long way to go, but the tide is shifting. And I encourage everybody, please, to follow along with Shelterforce's Tenant Power Returns series to learn more about that, both some history and some forward-looking articles on what's going on now. And remind you again to support Shelterforce through Newsmatch. November and December only, your donation will be matched. And I also want to apologize to the folks who came in late, because we had some technical difficulties with our maximum at the beginning. Thank you for sticking with us, and we will have a recording up on the website in a couple of days, so you'll be able to view anything that you missed. So thank you again, and I agree, the chat conversation, what I've seen of it, has been really great. So thank you to everyone for participating, and thank you to our wonderful panelists.